So welcome to the Mission Center for Sustainability Solutions and our Sustainability Talk series. My name is David Hart. I'm the director here. I'm going to skip some stuff. It's now my pleasure, with a few minute delay, to introduce today's speaker, Damian Brady. Damian is a professor of oceanography and UMaine School of Marine Sciences. He's based at the Darling Marine Center. He's also a faculty fellow here at the Mitchell Center. Damian's research is focused on a wide range of important challenges associated with the sustainable use of marine resources, especially in the Gulf of Maine, including lobster, sea-run fish like the 5+ million that swim up the Penobscot River every year, aquaculture, as you'll hear, coastal water quality, renewable energy, and with all these kinds of issues, they require, sustainability requires a consideration of a wide range of factors: economic, environmental, social. And one of the things I especially admire, and I encourage you to think about during Damian's talk, go to his website. He talks about the commitment to improve the management of these systems in ways that reflect the values of coastal communities that rely on them. And this is a really important emphasis. What does it take for a public university like ours to align its work with the values of communities? This is a question we return to again and again at the Mitchell Center as we try to increase the usefulness of our work in Maine. Today, Damian's going to talk about these innovative collaborations that he and others are doing to grow scallop aquaculture in the Gulf of Maine. Please join me in welcoming Damian.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just start by saying I think I gave this lecture over 10 years ago when I first got here to the University of Maine, and I was talking about modeling water quality in the Chesapeake Bay. And so more than 10 years later, it turns out that the water quality in Maine is quite a bit better than the Chesapeake, so I had to find other things to do, and sea scallop aquaculture is definitely pretty high on the list. I want to start by saying that what I'm going to be doing is talking about the work of multiple graduate students here, Struan Coleman, who worked on scallops and now co-owns one of the larger scallop farms in the state of Maine, Phoebe Ekelek, who's now a postdoc in our group, doing spat collection, Thomas Kifney, who defended his dissertation a couple of weeks ago, Sydney Abina, who's done the hatchery work, and Christopher Norn, who's done some of our bioeconomic work. But much of what I'm talking about starts with Dana Morse of Maine Sea Grant and Hugh Copperthwaite of CEI. So by a twist of fate, a ship in Maine ended up in Aomori Prefecture in Japan. And Aomori Prefecture in Japan is the home to Hokkaido, and Aomori Prefecture are home to the largest scallop industry, one of the largest scallop industries in the world. A couple $1 billion worth of scallops get landed and exported out of Japan. So the state of Maine and Aomori Prefecture have a relationship, and Hugh Copperthwaite and Dana Morse and Don Hudson and others that I think we all know about have been keeping this connection alive over time. And one of the deep ways that this connection has been made is trying to take some of the learnings that they've come up with about how to grow sea scallops where they are here in Aomori Prefecture and up here in Hokkaido, and apply it to the coast of Maine. Okay, as I was trying to put this talk together, I was trying to think of all the challenges that scallop growers face, and it turned out to be a really, really long list. And after I made it, I thought, why is anyone doing this? So let me give you a sense of what the challenges are here. So a lot of times what I receive or hear about is we already catch a lot, so why culture them, right? We have a wild fishery in the state of Maine. In 2023, we caught about 27.4 million pounds of sea scallop meats that were valued over $360 million. It's one of the top 5 largest fisheries in North America. So we already catch a lot. Why try to culture them when you can just get them for free and go offshore and get them? But it turns out that we import another $300 to $400 million worth of scallops into this country. So as much as we think we're catching a lot, it's not nearly enough to satiate the just the domestic market alone, never mind the ability potentially to export them. The other thing that makes scallop aquaculture, I think, really, really interesting, at least from a state of Maine's perspective, it's probably the only organism for which we have a wild fishery and we're culturing them. You know, we grow oysters in this state, but we don't catch oysters in the wild. We grow salmon, but we don't catch salmon in the wild. We catch lobsters, but we don't grow lobsters. So this is the only species that I can think of, other than maybe loosely the elver fishery, where some of us grab elvers and then grow them out and recirculate in aquaculture companies' systems. So this is a really interesting species just from that standpoint, that we catch scallops and we also grow them in the state. They have a really long larval period. So when we are trying to be good in a hatchery for oyster larvae, usually it takes oyster larvae about 14 days in their planktonic period to set, and then we can put them into nursery, grow out, and then eventually grow out. But scallops, as we're about to learn, they can be 30 to 40 days. Humans are really good at being good at something for about 2 weeks, and they're really bad at being good at something for 30 to 40 days. They hate high density culture. They all want to be alone. They don't want to hang out with anyone else. You can put 100 oysters in one of the oyster grow bags and 4 of them in an oyster grow cage, and they are very, very happy. With scallops, they swim around. What we knife each other. You have to raise them at very, very low densities. Anything that you have to raise on low densities is going to be more difficult to farm. You need more acreage. They have a very limited catch state, and by that I mean this catch muscle. So if you've ever eaten a scallop, the only thing you've eaten is this, about 17% of their soft tissue weight, and that's the adductor. And they have a very, very small, hard muscle. If you've ever eaten a scallop and sometimes it's left on, that's the extent of its catch muscle, which is the muscle that keeps a bivalve closed. So they have a very, very small, very, very poorly developed catch muscle, almost certainly because they live in deeper water and they're not ever going to be out and desiccated. If you take them out of the water for more than 5 to 10 minutes, there's a large chance that they're going to die. It turns out that this little muscle on the scallop makes all the difference. You cannot handle them. You can't just take them out of the water, clean your cages for an hour, and then put them back in the water and hope they're going to be okay. Or as we do in the oyster industry, we flip cages, we leave them out for hours, and then we flip the cages back again and they're fine. You can't handle them. Don't look at them funny. They can biomagnify toxins. So everything about this organism that you see here that is not the adductor muscle can hold on to saxitoxin or domoic acid, causing amnesiac shellfish poisoning or paralytic shellfish poisoning. So they're really, really potentially fatal if you eat the whole thing. Now, if you just eat the adductor muscle, it doesn't hold on to the biotoxin. So you're trying to grow this organism that is, the vast majority is by weight is the shell. And then only 17% of the soft tissue is that adductor muscle. And so you're trying to grow something and throw away mostly all of it. Another reason why this is a tough one. They're mobile. They move. Unlike my mussels, unlike my oysters, I can put them down and I can go and find them later on. So with oysters, we can do things like bottom planting. Mussels will naturally biss onto threads and rope and then stay right there. They're mobile. And they grow kind of slow. They don't grow nearly as fast as oysters or mussels. And so if you want to get them to market size, you're going to have to wait a while, 3 to 4 years instead of 2 years for an oyster. After I made the slide, I was like, I should just cancel the rest of the talk. No one should do this. It makes no sense that anyone does this. So in other words, a real pain. And yet, there are a group of resilient farmers in Maine that are making this work. And I bring up this picture because unlike some other forms of aquaculture, let's say like the American eel or kelp, where there's a lot of consumer education that's necessary to find the right markets for these products, there's no consumer education needed for this species. If you can grow it, people will eat it. And almost, there's no end to the market for it. And the real subtlety is finding the right market for your product based on the cost of production. So a lot of what I'll talk about today is bioeconomic modeling to come up with just how much it's costing growers to actually grow this product and how does that compare with the prices that you can get. So the US scallop market, it's an opportunity for Maine. The way Sebastian Bell put it to me the other day is that Fisheries are resource limited. You can only catch so much of them. Aquaculture is permission limited, which is to mean if you got more permission, you'd be able to scale and create more product. And so that's the opportunity, because as landings decline, this is just a picture of scallop landings. As landings decline and imports increase, there's a huge opportunity in Maine because Maine is the only state in the country that's doing this, and it has the opportunity to scale. Right now, Maine scallops make up a tiny fraction of the total US landings, most of which are coming through Massachusetts on the wild side. But Maine scallops consistently fetch higher prices amongst the US supply. So if the roughly commodity scale price for a scallop that you buy at a restaurant is maybe $10 or $15 a pound, you can get $30 to $60 per pound for a Maine product into the right market, which is pretty key to the development of aquaculture because it is expensive to grow these. Just to put this in perspective, this is global aquaculture, scallop aquaculture production by nation. So we are colored yellow here as emerging, but it's really just Maine. It's just you get to color the whole rest of the United States when you make these maps. Similarly with Canada, Atlantic Canada has been trying this, Russia, but you know, the big players are always Korea, Japan, China, and Peru for scallop aquaculture production. And it's quite large. It's basically second only to oysters for bivalve production in the world. And we'd like to take, you know, the United States and make it go from yellow to green. So today I want to summarize a few decades of efforts to culture Atlantic sea scallops in the Northwest Atlantic. So we're going to be taking as many lessons from Canada as we can. I'm going to start with seed. I mentioned that sea scallops have a long larval period. We have to overcome that. We're going to talk about from the seed into what we call nursery culture, usually in lantern and pearl nets, which you'll see. Grow out. So now at some point, the scallops get large enough that if I want to get them to market, I have two choices for the most part. Lantern nets, I just sit them in these nets, they hang in the water and they grow. Or I can do what's called ear hanging or Japanese ear hanging, and you'll see what that looks like. Then we're going to talk about some bioeconomics. How do we make tools capable of informing the right trade-offs that growers face? Then the markets. There are two markets. I could sell the whole scallop, which I said before is dangerous, but if I test it for biotoxin, I can sell that to you and you can eat it, and it's worth a lot. Or the adductor only, which is just what we're all used to eating. And I should say that everyone in this room who's ever had a scallop, 99.99% of the time that scallop has been flash frozen at sea. So it's been caught, it's been shucked, it's been flash frozen at sea, and then thawed right before you ate it. So the other market opportunity for Maine is something that Toad Braun and others call a dayboat scallop. So I can get you that scallop that day so you can actually eat a fresh scallop. This is the only way you can eat a fresh scallop right now is through Maine. So the three stages of the Maine farm scallop industry, 1970 to let's say roughly 2010, Struan calls this the knowledge gathering stage, where we learned lessons from Atlantic Canada, Japan, and the beginnings of the US-Japanese relationship that I described before, Aomori Prefecture in Maine. Then 2011 we'll roughly call the industry beginnings. We got regulatory approval in the state of Maine to sell a whole scallop product, which was huge. There was a lot of tech transfer with Japan, and I'll show that. And there were early grower trials and Sea Grant collaborations. And now I think we're in this 2018 to present, we're in commercial operations. So we're bringing together the industry regulators, Japanese expertise, and seafood markets. In 2021, this is the first time that DMR reported landings of cultured scallops. So just to give you a sense of how new we are and how it took from 1970 to now to get to that phase. I had to give a shout out to the Darling Center. So this is a really good time series when I think mussel aquaculture, oyster aquaculture, scallop aquaculture all started at the Darling Marine Center within the state of Maine. 1999, Maine delegation to Aomori Prefecture, where we learned about spat collection. I'll get into that in a second. I want to come all the way down here to 2018 and 2017, ear hanging trials in Maine, not trails. I don't know what ear hanging trails are. And then the equipment arrives and the first scallops sale, live scallops begins. 2021 is the first purchase of Hamadi equipment, which I'm going to show you right now. There was a lot of coverage of this initially in 2021. This is a New York Times article in August of 2021. They pick up the phenomenon, but little do they know that there was still a huge amount of work to do. That's the first year of reported landings in the state. Erin French in The Lost Kitchen highlighted it in her show, and then folks started selling these scallops in her farmer's market, and that started to get a lot of coverage. And then right up until, I think it's last year in Hope on the Water, where Martha Stewart went out with Andrew Peters and his family. Hope on the Water, check it out. But and they also, and she reviewed the scallop story, and that's Andrew Peters and his family down here on the bottom. Just to put this in perspective, still really, really small. This is a great figure that Tom Kipney has put together, but this shows you sort of the aquaculture harvest value over time. We had to dig through a lot of DMR data to get this sort of all put together, but you can see that from a bivalve perspective, we're mostly dominated by eastern oyster and blue mussels, which have been sort of increasing. I mean, you can see on the eastern oyster side, we're talking about a 10-fold increase since 2011. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that this little bar is what we're talking about today. 2021 first reported landings about $100,000, and then by 2023 we had 600,000. So we increased our production about 6-fold over the course of a year, which was super exciting for this industry. Where did this start, the scallop aquaculture? So the early innovation, and we're going to be talking about spat collection, so I just wanted you to see that, but overfishing in the 1960s led to a gentleman named Kudo Toyosaku, a Mutsu Bay fisherman, creating an innovative spat collector by wrapping a traditional cedar leaf oyster collector in an onion bag. And little did they know that this would launch the industry, and we're going to see some video about how we're still doing things very similar to the way Kudo did back in those days. So the method we're showing, and I should say, this is a pretty common story. Not the overfishing leading to the innovation of an aquaculture story. And in fact, I spent an hour with folks from New Zealand who have absolutely overfished the New Zealand scallop, and they're in the same boat where they would like to start an aquaculture industry for the scallop because they overfished their resource. Pretty common story. So it's been used in Japan for over 30 years. And just to put this in perspective, in 2012, the Japanese cultured scallop landings were about one metric ton, worth almost 3.6 billion in US dollars. So what does this look like? I have a little video that sort of goes through the whole process, and this video is thank you to Hugh Copperthwaite for putting this together. What you're seeing is the spat collection. So that was the initial trips to Japan. That's Nate Perry. So you're bringing in bags that have Netron in it. You leave those bags out for months, you pick up those bags, and inside those bags are little scallops, and that's your seed. So for the most part, guys are getting their seed for free from these scallop bags. The next phase are these lantern nets. Those are those blue nets. Once you have those little scallops in there, they go in these lantern nets. This is what I called nursery or intermediate culture. I got to get those little scallops that I got in the little spat bags, and I got to get them a little bigger. This is the technology transfer that I'm going to be talking about. There's a bunch of stuff here. One of them is a dropper line washer, but one of them is an automatic drill and pinning machine. So we'll sort of see that. This is the sorter. This actually turned out to be really, really useful. It looks like, oh, it's just a shaking table, but this is another Hamadi instrument, but it's been incredibly quick to sort the scallops by the scallops that I can ear pin or the scallops that need to go back into the lantern net. And you'll see that for the most part, our cost of production is driven by labor. So anything that saves labor, really, really important. So now I've got them ready for pinning. It's usually about 50 millimeters. And this is when they're actually pinning the scallop. So what you're about to see is Nate Perry using one of the early drilling machines that was brought in. It, of course, is designed for the Japanese scallop, which is a yeso scallop. These are Atlantic sea scallops or placoplectin. And we had to actually calibrate this instrument so that it could actually drill. And during calibration, things are going really, really slowly, but you'll see in a second here that by the time you get really good at it, you're just at the mercy or the the limitation of, I'll just show that one more time, but you're then at the limitation of someone who can get the scallop into the brackets in time. So we think with this new Tech 3 that we've been using, which actually drills and sets the scallop on the pin, that we might be able to do something like 14,000 scallops a day with 2 people, which is super cool. Right now, that machine, you had to manually pin them on there, so that was not fun. And we're gonna find out better ways of doing that, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what that looks like. This is another, again, labor saving. So this is a power washer that's designed for just these kinds of long lines. So they go in, they get cleaned on the other side. So we're testing them on some plastic scallop shells to see what it's gonna be like. And then later on, you'll see those are the lines coming in. Biofouling is a huge problem, but you can see the scallops coming in on one side, getting cleaned, and then coming out on the other side really clean. Everything about what we've been doing is about technology transfer and, you know, saving on labor. That's pretty cool. And then that line is still attached on the other side. Okay. So because right now the entire industry is essentially at the mercy of where they're gonna get spat in the wild, you put that spat bag collector in and then 3 or 4 months later you come back. What if you lost your spat bags? What if you didn't put them in the right spot? In the next coming year, your industry wouldn't have enough seed to survive and move forward. So a group of us in the state of Maine, which is a really, really lucky state, we've got at least 4 or 5 hatcheries, shellfish hatcheries in the state. Not a lot of states that can brag about that, but we do. So we brought a bunch of different hatcheries together to try and see if we could crack this nut. There is no hatchery for the Atlantic sea scallop in the world. And that's because, and this is a beautiful rendition, this is Hattie Stiles at the Darling Center who illustrated this, which is awesome. But I just want to point out, like 20 to 30 days to get from what we call a dehinged larvae to a pedovillager or a scallop with a foot basically ready to settle. 24 hours, 3 days, 20 to 30 days, 5 to 15 days for a newly settled juvenile. So you can see how these days start to add up. And if it's gonna take 40 days to get you to settleable, you're gonna be in trouble. Just to put this in perspective, oysters go through this process in 2 weeks. And, but if you have a hatchery, it confers resilience to any aquaculture system. I really call it a climate adaptation. If you're gonna worry about things like ocean acidification, then you can buffer your seawater at the hatchery stage. You can select for faster growth, you can stabilize your seed supply, you can confer disease resistance. If you get a disease, most of the reason that we have an oyster industry is because hatcheries figured out how to have brood stock that were resistant to certain diseases. So what I'm gonna go over now is Sydney Avina's masters, where she worked with across multiple multiple hatcheries to try to crack this code. I will point out that this is the way humans act. This is the scallop landings over time. And every time the scallops have crashed, there's been a significant effort to try to generate a sea scallop hatchery. And then it seems like the year that you decide to try to get a sea scallop hatchery, the sea scallop fishery like rebounds and then people forget about it. And pretty similarly here in the mid to late 90s, someone was like, oh, we're in the same boat. But one interesting thing to note, so now we're trying it now here. We're at a point where the southern New England stock is pretty healthy. And the mid-Atlantic bite though is in real trouble. And by real trouble, I mean like very, very, very serious trouble, like all-time lows in the mid-Atlantic bite fishery. They are asking about stock enhancement. So they would like us to develop hatcheries so they could seed these areas, which has been successful in Japan and the Bay of Brest in France. But I will say in Japan, they do a lot of predator control. So if you're gonna set down all these juvenile scallops, they will go and actually kill the sea stars that might eat them otherwise. And we are just not good at predator control. There's be a lot of people that have a problem with that. So we're in the midst of this. We're developing it here. And I think that the key is, can we be long-term about it? Can we start just to do this as a regular supply, and whether it's for enhancement or maybe it's just for the aquaculture industry. So we got together with 3 hatcheries, Mook Sea Farm, which is upriver of us, the Damascotta River and the Darling Marine Center, that's us, and the Down East Institute at Beals Island. I'll roughly say that Mook Sea Farm is definitely a commercial operation. We are definitely a research operation and not used to scaling. And then Down East Institute is remarkable in that they sort of operate both ways. They have commercial parts of their operation and research parts of their operation. So, and it's a 4-year collaboration between us and these 2 other hatcheries. And we shared standard operating procedures and troubleshot together. And we would meet weekly to sort of go over what was working and what wasn't working. If you're not familiar with how hatcheries work, you get a well-conditioned male gonad, a well-conditioned female gonad. That just means you brought these scallops into your lab and then you fed them a lot so that they would invest a lot of energy in reproduction. You can usually use a thermal shock to get them to spawn eggs and sperm, and then you put them together and you have a bucket full of collected eggs, and then you move that forward through the process and feed that over time. I'm not gonna bore you too many with these, but I just wanna say that Mook Sea Farm was by far the most successful of the 3 hatcheries. Maybe not a surprise because they are a commercial hatchery used to doing things in a particular way. This is their percent survival of those eggs over time. Like any good hatchery, there's a lot of dying that happens over the course of these experiments, and so that's this decline in percent survival across years. And we tried lots of different things. We tried buffering the seawater in different ways. We tried flow through. We tried self-contained systems. But I just want to point out that the biggest thing we found is that we got better every year we did it. And by we, I mean Mook Sea Farm. It was less about the individual treatments within a trial and more about the fact that you can see this dashed line when they settled out was day 33, then it was day 32, then it was day 27, then it was day 24. So over time, they were getting better at moving scallops through. And in fact, this is a great figure that Sydney Avina made, but this is the larval day period and the shell height that they achieved over time. And so each year, this slope got sharper. And in fact, we were sort of reinventing people's perspective on scallop larvae because basically Mook says, you know, we can get these organisms through the whole process in 24 days. And in fact, it's a necessity. The longer it goes, the more probability is you're gonna have a serious failure. And so I went promptly out and I hired one of the Mook Sea Farm shellfish hatchery technicians. He works for us now, and we're hoping to do this year and try to do everything that they did in their way. One of the cool things Sydney did is she went and then got an IRB and interviewed every hatchery worker that was working on the project. And even though we were meeting weekly and really trying to do everything the same so that we could actually compare things, she started to notice these differences in the way that the different hatcheries were operating, and through the qualitative interview process really came up with some really cool information on just exactly what Mook Sea Farm was doing with their water when it came in. And it turned out they were doing something called aging water. They were pumping in water, letting it sit for a day and then using it in their drain downs, for instance. We all, turns out, filtered our water in different ways. We were using conical tanks and they were using flat bottom tanks. So even just the real subtle things, when she really went and looked under the hood, were really interesting. And so these are the kinds of things that we want to do next year so that we have essentially a turnkey approach to generating spat in the future. So we have a chicken or the egg problem. So this is work that Christopher Noren's doing, is how do you invest in a hatchery when it's going to be unprofitable to invest in the hatchery at the beginning, and possibly when there's enough wild spat to fuel the fishery in the meantime. So this is the kind of sort of government research that's required to do something that's going to be unprofitable initially, but potentially really important in the long run. So it's a chicken or the egg problem. The chicken is the scallop and the egg is the spat. And this, in the absence of consistent supply of spat, how does grower demand develop to justify hatchery interest when hatcheries rely on grower demand to develop? So we're stuck in a logic loop here where no one's going to make the initial move for a hatchery until they have to, and by that time, it's usually too late. So we put together a lot of the last 4 or 5 publications on this have all been techno-economic analyses. So if you are not an economist, I'll just assure you that I am definitely not an economist. So I will walk you through this as much as I can. So we used those hatchery interviews, and we came up with a price for how much it was costing Moog Sea Farm, or what I'm calling COP, cost of production to produce seed. And then we went with Nate Perry and we examined everything he did to collect wild spat, and we generated an economic model of how much it cost him to collect wild spat. And we compared those numbers and created a net present value, which is the value proposition between one and the other. We looked at different scales. So if you were trying to collect 20,000 seed on each visit, 100,000 or 200,000 seed, and how efficient your spat bag collectors were. And through the IRB interviews with the hatchery, we looked at hatcheries that could produce 1 million seed, 5 million seed, and 20 million seed. And we looked at 36 different scenarios, uncertainty in the wild spat collection. And I won't bore you with all the details, but the net present value really depended on how efficient your wild spat collection got. And so the less efficient your wild spat collection was, if you were only doing 20,000, then your hatcheries were much more profitable. So in the future, we're going to be really, really interested in how consistent people can collect wild spat out in the field using those spat collectors. What's super interesting about Japan is their industry is so big, they have so many scallops in the water that they just rely on the scallops they're growing to produce the seed for the next generation. So when they put spat bag collectors out, the industry's so big and a scallop is using so much of their energy on reproduction that they just collect the scallop spat from their own industry. And that may be the way it works in Maine, but they have a place called Mutsu Bay where most of their operations are happening, and it's very self-contained. And Maine is very distributed, right? We have 4,000 miles of tidal shoreline. So it's going to be really, really hard to co-locate seed collection and the industry in the future. All right, let's talk a little bit about finding the right site. This is a COVID project. I had 2 students, Drew and Coleman, and Tom. We weren't allowed to go to work. So they, like we all were at the time, and they started compiling every scallop growth rate they could find in a cultured system. And this is kind of where I say that we've been sort of following Atlantic Canada. Atlantic Canada was deeply invested in this in the 90s and figuring out whether scallop aquaculture could work. And you can see in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick that they were trying these growth projects, even some in Cobscook and then some of our own growth studies. So they found 14 published and unpublished data sets of scallop growth and mortality, 305 shell growth rates, and 214 mortality rates. And then they used this in a generalized additive model, and they used culture method, the stocking density, depth, temperature, and Julian day to figure out what made the best growth rates for scallops. They calculated the scallop density by knowing what the surface area of a lantern net was, and then calculating how many scallops and how big they were. And they took the total scallop area over the net surface area. Where are scallops going to grow well? Between 10 and 15 degrees. So this is the generalized additive model. They grow super, super well at 10 to about 12.5 degrees C. So you're looking for a site that spends the most amount of time at 12.5 degrees. Stocking density, they're just extremely sensitive to stocking density. The more and higher you stock them, you get over 100%, by the way, when people pile scallops on top of each other. So there's a scallop net and they're just like laying on top of each other. It does not go well. And then we looked at lantern and pearl nets. The problem and the interesting thing about most species when you think about climate and thermal tolerance is they grow well between 12 and 15 degrees, but their mortality also goes up around this time period. So like most machines, they're performing at a really, really high level, but they can be less resilient to perturbations. So the temperature goes up, their mortality goes up, but so does their growth rate. And production equals growth and mortality, right? So those two things have to be balanced. And same with shell height. So the smaller they are, the more susceptible they are to mortality. If you get them to 25 millimeters, they usually do pretty well. Super interesting, if you use Julian day and mortality rate, their mortality really starts to go up in the fall. And we think that's because they put so much energy into reproduction. The largest gonads in the animal kingdom, that they're very, very, once they're spent, they're very, very susceptible to problems in the fall. And that's usually when they're spawning. This is kind of a cool map. So we just took all of the sea surface satellite temperature data And we looked over the course of 2 years and we said, where in the Northwest Atlantic Ocean is there over 600 days between 10 and 15 degrees C over the course of 2 years? And it just lights up that all of down East Maine spends almost all the time between 10 and 15 degrees. And that's what makes this, I think, so interesting. As we've increased tenfold in the production of oysters in the state, all of these really hot subtidal areas where we're growing oysters, they're going to be saturated with oysters. But Maine has 100 times more area that it could apply to scallop aquaculture than it ever could apply to oyster aquaculture. Okay, as I said before, you can sell two products, and the one is the whole scallop. If I'm in Asia or Europe, I would be used to eating the whole scallop, but here in the United States, we're only used to this, eating this, and we throw away the rest of it. If you can sell the whole scallop, you can sell it when it's smaller. If you need to grow it all the way to adductor side, then it takes 3 or 4 years. And the reason that this is a problem is that scallops grow slowly. So even just to get from a whole scallop to an adductor requires a whole other year. And that's why we think this bioeconomic modeling has been really, really useful, because the primary research goals, we're collecting data and modeling those methods, finding out the results, giving conclusions and next steps in this bioeconomic modeling. But now we can tell a grower, this is how much it costs to produce a scallop if you're trying to sell to the whole scallop market. And this is how much it would cost to produce it for just the adductor muscle. Again, I won't go too deep into this, but again, more semi-structured interviews, quantifying the cost of production, cash flow, cost structure, and model sensitivities. We're trying to generate a net present value. So how much value is in the farm over time? I want to just briefly go over this, but these are the kinds of questions you have to ask to develop these kinds of models. And I'm just going to highlight here vessel cost and specification. One of the things that's kind of cool is that we can now assume you have a boat and a pickup truck, because you're a lobsterman that's thinking about getting into this. And many of the ones that are lobstermen getting into this. Then it takes away one of their big CapEx costs, for instance. And then we put everything I talked about before, spat collection versus juvenile culture, and the time required to complete tasks. So it's a very detailed model. And we did one where we assumed you're a lobsterman. We did one where we assumed you're not a lobsterman, and so you had to pay for everything. And then we did a model for whether you're selling the whole scallop or the shucked meat. Our initial model, because I'm going to show you the adductor only model, you're going to be like, well, no one should ever do that as a business. We assume the commodity price for scallops, about $10.50 at that time. And we assumed that a whole scallop, someone could get at least $1 an individual. And one of the things we notice when we calculate cost of production goes up, it goes down as the farms get bigger. So you probably need to be at a place where if you're selling a whole scallop, you need to be at 400, 500,000 annual sales of scallops. It's a lot of scallops if you want to get to the prices of getting below $1 a piece, which is sort of what we're looking for. But if you already own your own boat and you already own your own truck, you could pretty much start at a smaller scale right off the bat, which was a super cool result. Similarly here on the whole scallop market, things get tougher for you, and we'll look at that in a second. This is the net present cash value. So this is your net cash flow. You can see you're in the hole initially because you buy all your equipment, you buy your ear hanging equipment, and then by year 3 or 4, if you're selling a whole scallop, and these are different scenarios of how big your production is, then you start to make money and you can have a cash flow in the hundreds of thousands if you're selling 600,000 scallops and you've paid back some of your debt and equity here. This is our result for a shucked meat. So if you're trying to sell into that adductor only market, you pretty much don't make money through any of our models. This is a tough way to go, especially at $10.15. But what we've noticed is that some of our partners can get 40 to sometimes even 60. And then this really, really changes the game. The other thing that we realized is that labor is everything. So as I move up and get higher and higher into my production, a lot of these fixed costs don't change all that much, but my labor goes up. So everything is about labor, and therefore everything's about technology transfer. So this is the new Tech 3. You can see it actually has a rope on it this time. So when you pin the scallop, it actually puts the pin in the scallop. So it does everything for you all at once. So this is part of a small business administration grant, but that's Andrew Peters putting the, oh, sorry, that's Matt actually. And then they're putting the scallops in and it's coming through and actually pinning it and then dropping it into the rope online, which is super cool. We actually grew scallops then at their site and we determined what usually you want to get to 90 millimeter for a whole scallop, 100 to get an abductor muscle, and it takes you 3 years to get to that point. But some of these growth rates were a lot higher than we had seen in the past. And just notice that it asymptotes. If you want to get more than 100 millimeters scallops, it's going to take you years. One thing that's cool, this is something Chris Norton found, but this is the size of scallops, millimeters of scallops at different years from NOAA, where they did annuli. They just count the rings in the 1979, 56 or 79 millimeters in carapace, or in not carapace length, but in shell height. And it takes them about 4 years. So we know now that we can get our scallops to about 3 years if we're growing them up in the water column at higher temperatures and better food conditions. So usually the scallops that are growing in aquaculture are growing twice as fast as your wild scallop, which is really, really useful to know. And that is, I think, primarily because our farm scallops are putting all their energy into soft tissue and not into shell. So this is work by Phoebe Yeklek, but this is the meat. Everything in green here is farmed. So you can see their meat weight for a scallop at the same height or the same total mass is much, much higher in green. The gonad is much, much higher. The viscera is much, much higher, but the shell is much, much higher in a wild scallop. So a wild scallop is putting on lots and lots of weight into their shell for the same shell height. I think it's pretty cool because I'm like, I wonder how the scallops know that they're safe. If they're in a lantern net or they're ear hung in the water column, how do they know that I can put more energy into my soft tissue like reproduction and muscle and less energy into my shell? But somehow they know. At the end of the day, the big advantage with ear hanging and that ear hanging advantage compounds over time is that you can put way more scallops on the same lease acreage. There's a huge impetus in the state of Maine to use your acreage judiciously because there's a lot of opponents of aquaculture that get angry when a particular lease size is really, really big. And so we just noticed that we can get to max production units on a 10 to 30 acre farm of 300,000 in ear hanging. And especially as we get bigger, that compounds over time. We can sort of see this here. This is all the solid lines are ear hanging. So you can get much more production on the same lease acreage, 0.08 square kilometers in the solid line. When you're using lantern net, it's just the space becomes so inefficient because you have to thin them to get to that low density. And then you just need more and more and more and more nets over time. Okay, I'll skip some of this. I want to talk a little bit about some of the new initiatives online here, but if any of you are familiar with the kelp farming manual that was put out, the main kelp farming manual that Paul Dobbins and other people did, it's been downloaded over 10,000 times globally and has helped spur the Farm Kelp Center. We're working with Vertical Bay and other folks to come up with a scallop farming manual on all of the stuff that I've talked about and we've learned today. So I'm excited to bring that out. Our partner farming model, scallops are a 1-year spat collection and then 2 years on the farm. So if we break out the supply chain in discrete chunks, specialization, we can remove barriers to entry and allow individuals to choose the stage that's most applicable to their existing infrastructure. So if you are good at spat collection and want to sell spat as seed, that's great. If you're really, really good at that intermediate culture, really good at putting that spat just into lantern nets, but you don't want to spend $50,000 on a Tech 3 drilling machine, that's fine. Get your product to 50 millimeters and then sell it to a company that's maybe a little bit larger in scale. That we're seeing is working. We have 3 or 4 new partner farmers that are just doing the intermediate culture and then selling the 50 millimeters seed to a company that can drill and pin and set, and that's really exciting. I think I spent most of our time talking about how far behind we are for like compared to China, which by the way is raising our scallop. So the Chinese were generating the most scallop biomass in the world. They actually grow the bay scallop, the scallop that lives here in Maine, which is astounding. So they're massive in scale, but they're actually raising our scallop. But maybe we're far behind some of those countries, but we're really, really far ahead of others. So we're starting a knowledge exchange with the University of Auckland and Dr. Brad Skelton to grow the New Zealand scallop, which is exciting. They told me that they get 20 spat in a bag. This is data from Phoebe, and we can sometimes get 30 to 60,000 baby scallops in a spat bag. So they will have to do a hatchery in New Zealand. There's just they don't even have enough scallops to get enough spat to even start. This is super cool. This is Christy Walton's group called Ialumbra is opening up a new aquaculture innovation center in La Paz, Mexico. And they want to grow, this is called the Cayo de Hacha. That is a scallop. I know it doesn't look like a scallop, but it makes a huge scallop. It's unbelievable, and it lives in the mud. So we're starting to work with them on a lot of what we learned in our applied aquaculture R&D to start raising the Cayo de Hacha in La Paz, Mexico, which is pretty cool and exciting. Okay, with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you so much.
First, can we all clap again for this just amazing, wonderful, wonderful talk? Really, just really great. So there were so many things that you said, so much that we learned. And if we aren't economists, but we want to learn from your work, and you mentioned that a lot of the articles that you and your team have written are for economists. Where might we learn more? I mean, we could follow you around day after day, but if we wanted to learn more from reading, where might we look?
Yeah, so depends on, so first of all, email me if you're interested. Happy to provide you all those PDFs, Damian.Brady@maine.edu. The scallop farming manual, when that comes out, I think that's going to be the most accessible, and we're writing it for prospective farmers. And then the best materials that I've seen on this come from Aquaculture and Shared Waters. I was just talking to these guys over here, that Aquaculture and Shared Waters has a lot of fantastic material that's designed for a prospective grower who's thinking about getting into this.
One of the questions was, speaking of shared water, are fishermen excluded from access to the water that the state leases out to farms? Or are they, can you do the scallop, be doing that on that leased?
Yeah, I mean, when you go out to Vertical Bay or Marsden or other people's farms, there's definitely, you can see lobster traps around. Yeah, so it's not necessarily an exclusion, but it's also fish at your own risk in those areas, right? If you tangle your gear up.
Thank you. Another question is, you talked at various points about aligning your work with the values of communities. Can you give us another example or an example of that, or someplace we could learn more? Because that's just so interesting and important.
Yeah, I think what has been interesting to me about doing this and why scallops are really super interesting is that we do have a fishery for scallops, right? So if we want to continue to produce scallops and to get them on the market and continue to get the premium that we get for Maine scallops, production is key. And so we have a fishery for dayboat scallops in the state of Maine, but the season only lasts 2 weeks. We catch our quota in 2 weeks and then it's over. It's not something that guys are doing full time. So that's why, people are used to selling and handling scallops within the state of Maine. This gives them another way, if this is already part of the culture, to figure out how to scale and have production that can be maybe more year round.
Suppose somebody thank you very much. Suppose somebody came to you and said, listen, I teach statistics courses in college, and I think a statistics textbook that really focused on the industry and all of the beautiful, wonderful slides that you have would really interest people because it's unusual and it's fascinating. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have been, well, there's lots of really fascinating pieces, but I will just quickly say that from an R&D perspective, we often have to do things at small scale to get replication. And one thing that I found fascinating is when you work with a grower, they don't have time for small scale little experiments, right? They need to produce at a scale and they need to do everything the same. And what I found fascinating about that is that when we worked with Mook Sea Farm and they were having so much success because they were working in a commercial scale hatchery at scale and at size, it made me feel like sometimes just by trying to get the R&D right and get our statistics right that we lose something along the way. And I'm not sure how to solve it, right? Because we still need replication to demonstrate that the standard errors don't overlap and that we have something significant here. But I will say that there's something about working at a commercial scale, even though it's oftentimes not replicatable, that we're missing a learning. And I don't know if that's the R&D to C, what sometimes they call the valley of death, like taking research and development and turning it into commercialization. That valley of death, there is some learning that I'm super interested in there. And I know that doesn't answer your statistics question, but I almost say that insofar as that's the textbook I want to write, which is how do I move from these sort of small scale, statistically significant, but treatment-based approaches to more production scale and still learn something.
Very interesting. I know we're all really interested in that comment. Another question was, why doesn't Cobscook mimic the Japanese bay in Amori?
Cobscook has a really, really fascinating fishery for scallops, and I think they identify strongly with scallops. I should say that one of the points I made, because I was I wanted to be sure I was done before 4 o'clock, was that we need more people to enter. Right now, it's dominated by folks in Penobscot Bay, which is great. But we would love to see more people try this, and Cobscook would be an awesome place to try this.
I know we've run out of time, and I'm sure there are questions in the room, but let me just say that everybody's going to leave today. Everybody who's been here is going to go home, and make their family listen to everything they learned, because there was so much that you said that was so interesting. So thank you.
Thanks, Linda. And let's thank Damian one more time.
Yeah.